The lost tools of learning. Is school teaching us the wrong things? A well-known restaurant chain recently ran a competition offering free food to adults who could correctly answer a series of GCSE questions. For anyone outside the United Kingdom, GCSEs are important school qualifications, usually taken by students at around the age of 16. Learners typically study subjects such as English, mathematics, science, history, and geography before sitting formal examinations. The restaurant's competition was meant to be lighthearted, but it raises a surprisingly important question. How much of what we learn at school do we still know as adults? Imagine giving a 10-year-old a worksheet designed for a 5-year-old. You would probably expect the 10-year-old to complete it quite easily. The knowledge learned at 5 should have been retained, used, and developed during the intervening years. So, if adults struggle to answer questions that 16-year-olds are expected to answer, what does that tell us?
Perhaps the adults have simply forgotten. That is perfectly normal. We all forget information that we do not regularly use. But that leads to a deeper question. If people learn something for an examination and then rarely use it again, what was the purpose of learning it? If education is meant to prepare young people for adult life, should adults not regularly use at least some of the knowledge and abilities developed at school? This does not mean that everything taught in school must have an obvious everyday application. Education is about much more than preparing someone to complete practical tasks. Knowledge can help us understand history, culture, science, society, and the world around us. However, the restaurant challenge does reveal a possible weakness in education. Students can spend years learning information, pass an examination, and then forget much of that information shortly afterwards. This raises an important question. Should the purpose of education simply be to teach students information, or should it also teach them how to think, how to question, and how to learn? In 1947, the English writer Dorothy L. Sayers gave a speech called The Lost Tools of Learning. It was delivered at an education course at Oxford and first published in 1948. Sayers was not primarily an educational researcher. She was a writer, poet, and Christian thinker, best known for her detective novels. Her speech was not a scientific study or a complete curriculum. It was a deliberately provocative argument about what she believed education had lost. Sayers looked at the education system of her time and noticed something that may sound remarkably familiar today. Schools were trying to teach more and more subjects. Teachers were extremely busy. Curriculums were becoming increasingly crowded. Students were learning large amounts of information, but Sayers questioned whether students were being taught how to learn. She observed that many educated adults struggled to define the words they used. They found it difficult to follow an argument, separate evidence from opinion, or identify faulty reasoning. People could be persuaded by confident speakers, advertisements, and political propaganda without examining the claims carefully. They might remember information from school, but they did not necessarily remember how that knowledge had been discovered, tested, or organized. Sayers described this as one of the great weaknesses of modern education. Students were being taught subjects, but they were not always being taught the art of learning. She compared this to teaching a child to play one song on the piano by copying the movements of the teacher. The child might eventually play that song perfectly, but if they have never learned to read music, understand scales, or recognize musical patterns, they may be unable to learn a different song independently. They have learned the performance, but they have not mastered the instrument. Sayers believes something similar was happening in education. A student might memorize enough information to pass a history examination. They might learn a formula for a mathematics test, or remember a scientific process long enough to reproduce it on paper.
But what happens when they encounter an unfamiliar problem?
Can they ask useful questions? Can they locate trustworthy information? Can they recognize when a source is unreliable? Can they examine the evidence? Can they change their mind when the evidence does not support their original position? Can they explain their conclusion clearly? For Sayers, these were the real tools of learning. To recover them, she looked back to a medieval model of education known as the trivium.
The trivium had 3 main parts: grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric.
These words can sound complicated or old-fashioned, but the underlying ideas are relatively simple. Grammar is about acquiring the foundations of knowledge. Dialectic is about learning how to reason. Rhetoric is about bringing ideas together and communicating them effectively. Grammar, in Sayers' model, means much more than punctuation or knowing where to place an apostrophe. It includes the essential language, facts, vocabulary, rules, and patterns needed to understand a particular area of knowledge. Before you can think carefully about climate change, for example, you need some scientific knowledge. You need to understand terms such as atmosphere, carbon dioxide, emissions, and temperature. Before you can evaluate a political argument, you need to understand the political system, the historical context, and what the important words being used actually mean. Critical thinking cannot take place in an empty mind. We need knowledge to think with. Sayers believed younger children were often particularly good at observing, naming, reciting, and remembering information. She therefore argued that the early stage of education should take advantage of their ability to accumulate knowledge. Some of her specific recommendations, such as giving Latin a central position in the curriculum, reflect her own time and educational background. We do not need to accept every recommendation to understand her wider point. Students need strong foundations. They need vocabulary, knowledge, and basic skills. However, these foundations are the beginning of education, not its final destination.
The second tool is dialectic. Dialectic means learning to question, reason, and test ideas.
Sayers noticed that as children grow older, many become increasingly argumentative. They question instructions, challenge adults, and look for inconsistencies. Rather than treating this only as difficult behavior, Sayers believed education could direct that argumentative energy towards something productive. Students could learn how to define their terms, recognize assumptions, compare competing explanations, and identify fallacies. They could be taught to ask, what evidence supports this claim? Is that evidence reliable? Does the conclusion actually follow from the evidence? Is the person responding to the argument or attacking the person making it? Has the meaning of an important word changed during the discussion? These abilities are extremely important today. We are surrounded by information. Social media posts, news reports, videos, advertisements, influencers, politicians, and artificial intelligence systems constantly present us with claims about the world. The modern problem is not simply finding information. It is deciding what deserves to be believed. A person can speak confidently and still be wrong. A video can look convincing and still be misleading. A graph can contain real numbers, but present them in a way that creates a false impression. Sayers feared that people were being sent into a world of mass persuasion without the intellectual tools needed to protect themselves. In the age of social media, deepfakes, and AI-generated content, her warning may be even more relevant now than it was in 1947.
The final part of the trivium is rhetoric. Rhetoric is the ability to bring knowledge and reasoning together and communicate the result clearly and persuasively.
It is not simply about sounding impressive. In Sayers' model, good communication must be built on accurate knowledge and sound reasoning. Otherwise, rhetoric becomes manipulation, the ability to make a weak argument sound convincing. At this stage, learners begin to connect ideas, form conclusions, develop creativity, and explore particular subjects in greater depth. Sayers suggested that students should complete a substantial piece of work and publicly defend it. Today, this might take the form of an extended project, a presentation, a dissertation, or a viva. A student would investigate a genuine question, select relevant evidence, reach a conclusion, explain their thinking, and respond to questions or criticism. This would demonstrate more than the ability to remember information for an examination. It would show whether the student could actually use what they had learned.
Sayers' argument also helps us think differently about the apparent competition between knowledge and skills.
Educational debates often ask whether schools should teach traditional subject knowledge or modern skills such as creativity, communication, and critical thinking. But perhaps this is the wrong choice. Knowledge without the ability to question and apply it can become disconnected information. Critical thinking without sufficient knowledge can become little more than unsupported opinion. Communication without knowledge or reasoning can become empty confidence. Students need all three. They need something to think about, a reliable way of thinking about it, and the ability to communicate what they have concluded.
However, Sayers' ideas should not be accepted without question. Her 3 stages of childhood were based largely on personal observation, not the kind of developmental research we would expect today.
Children do not all develop in exactly the same way or at the same speed. Learning also does not always follow a simple sequence. Memory, reasoning, and creativity can be developed together. Her proposed curriculum reflects the religious and cultural setting in which she was writing. It gives considerable importance to Latin and Christian theology while saying relatively little about practical learning, collaboration, emotional development, relationships, inclusion, or inequalities in education. We therefore do not need to recreate medieval education.
The continuing value of the lost tools of learning is found in the question it asks. What should remain when the student has forgotten the specific answer?
Perhaps forgetting some school knowledge is unavoidable.
Most adults will not remember every historical date, scientific term, mathematical formula, or quotation they learned as teenagers. But they should leave education with something more durable. They should know how to approach an unfamiliar subject. They should know how to ask a worthwhile question. They should know how to find and assess information. They should know the difference between a claim and evidence. They should be able to recognize weak reasoning, including weaknesses in their own arguments. They should be able to connect ideas from different subjects. And they should be able to explain what they think and why they think it.
A modern curriculum inspired by Sayers would still teach knowledge, but it would also make the process of learning visible. Teachers would not assume that students automatically learn how to research, reason, evaluate sources, or communicate simply because they attend lessons in different subjects. These abilities would be deliberately taught, demonstrated, practiced, and assessed across the curriculum. Students would not only be asked, "What is the correct answer?" They would also be asked, "How do you know? What evidence did you use? Why should we trust that source? What alternative explanation did you consider? Can you apply this idea to a new situation? And can you defend your conclusion?"
Perhaps the real problem revealed by adults struggling with GCSE questions is not simply that they have forgotten some facts. The more important question is what their education left behind once those facts were forgotten. If education only prepares students to answer familiar examination questions, much of that learning may eventually disappear. But if education gives people the tools to learn, question, evaluate, connect, and communicate, then it prepares them for questions that do not yet exist. And that may be the most important preparation for adult life and an unpredictable future.